Welcome to the Keiser Report. I am Max Keiser. Remember, it's yet again the 5th of November, and banksters and conmen still rule. It's been 400 years that rebellion has failed. For a rope was alas never hailed, and for this reason treasonous plots still abound. Indeed, it was Blankfein and Diamond who did these schemes called Ponzi contrived to blow the global economy sky high with 3 quadrillion derivatives laid deep in dark pools that did prove the market's overthrow. Boom went the markets, kaboom went the economy, poof went our wealth. And when the smoke did clear away, the toll booths were here to stay. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, speech, assembly, and association were no longer frickin' free, y'all, but a dollar, a nickel, and a dime. So remember that every 5th of November, when we pay Warner Brothers its copyright toll, we must drop another penny to the guy they call Jamie, Carney, or Blythe. Hip, hip, hooray, a penny for the guy. Stacy Herbert, yeah.
Max, it's the toll booth economy on the 5th of November. The president wants you to get rich on Obamacare. You being the banksters, of course. This is Tom Scully in the New York Times, and he was involved in the introduction of Medicare Schedule D, which has added trillions to our healthcare bill in the United States. But he was talking to hedge funds and private equity about Obamacare, and he said it's not a government takeover of medicine, it's the privatization of healthcare.
Well, I call this the digital divide or digital apartheid in America. You notice that when it comes to hardware and software to run a massive surveillance state run out of the NSA on behalf of the government, things seem to work flawlessly. But rolling out a computer program for healthcare, oh, it stinks. It's full of bugs. We have to be rebuilt. It's overly costly. It's the digital apartheid. If you live on one side of the apartheid wall, like that guy Scully, then everything works great. If you live on the other side of the apartheid wall, like 98% of the American population, nothing works, it costs too much, and you're living in a ghetto.
I thought you were going to say fakakta.
I was going to say fakakta, but fortunately I caught myself and I said fakakta instead.
Well, he's speaking to these hedge fund managers and private equity guys with billions of dollars, and he says he's planning on making billions of dollars off this, despite the fact that the mainstream media in America says it's all government run, it's socialism, blah, blah, blah. He says no matter what investors thought about Obamacare politically, and surely many here do not think of much of it, the law was going to make some people very rich. The Affordable Care Act, he said, wasn't simply a law that mandated insurance for the uninsured. Instead, it would fundamentally transform the basic business model of medicine. Billions could flow from Washington to Wall Street, indeed. So Obamacare, he's saying, is like the gunpowder plot of its time, and it can consolidate power and wealth to Wall Street.
Right, the gunpowder plot of its time when Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament, and we have coming down to us through the ages the 5th of November, made famous, of course, in the movie made by Warner Brothers called
V for Vendetta.
V for Vendetta, of course. And so here you have the similar gun plot plan, and you have a similar situation where you've got banksters who have replaced health care, which could be provided by the state in an affordable way, where they're acting like the Walmart of healthcare. They're buying stuff cheap that they pass on the savings to people. No. You've got instead, as Obama explained Obamacare, a series of exchanges. That was your tip-off. In an era when exchanges are completely corrupted by Wall Street, when every single exchange in the world is manipulated, when every single exchange in the world is corrupt and been infiltrated by terrorists, here you have frickin' Obama saying he's going to take healthcare and turn it into an exchange? What a dodo.
Well, as Scully points out, it's actually the privatization of healthcare, because right now, half of the population anyway in America is on either Medicaid or Medicare, and this is like the beginning of the privatization of healthcare, he says. Now, we're going to look at the energy market here, another market that they are pretending could be a free market, and it was owned by the government. It was under the auspices of the nation up until the 90s when it was liberalized. That's another word they use for privatized. Energy firms overcharge by 3.7 billion pounds a year. So back in the 90s when they liberalized it, the theory the politicians pushed on the population, the propaganda, was that profit margins would be about 1.5% because the likes of the supermarkets and Walmart, for example, operate on a profit margin of 2%. So they thought like these guys were going to be super competitive and it was going to reduce to 1.5%. Well, in fact, it's like 5 or 6% profit margin they're operating on because they have these profitable toll booths. And they were before Parliament this week, and Stephen Fitzpatrick, who's the CEO of OVO Energy, which is one of the smaller firms, it's not one of these big six giants. Well, he said after British Gas, Empower, SSE, and Scottish Power announced inflation-busting increases in household bills, Fitzpatrick said he, quote, cannot explain any of these price rises as his company is buying gas for 7% less than it was 2 years ago. Because remember, all these big energy firms have increased prices by over 9%, over £100 per year on their bills, and they're saying that they're coming up with all sorts of explanations, but none of it makes sense according to this guy who's basically a whistleblower saying, in fact, his costs have gone down, so he doesn't know why these big guys are going up.
Well, it's a mistake to say that transferring management of these assets to the private sector is so-called privatization. It is the transfer of these assets to a dictatorship and an oligopoly who is then imposing oligopolistic behavior and colluding. Remember those big six energy firms, here's the first crime they're guilty of. It's called collusion. It's a crime. They're all guilty of it. The one you just mentioned, Centrica, the other frickin' energy companies, it's called collusion. It's a crime. They're all guilty of it. And I make that charge without any equivocation whatsoever at all.
Well, Max, there's going to be an inquiry to see if that's true, because one of these guys called for an inquiry to see if there was competition, if he, this guy heading us, one of these big six, was competing fairly. And David Cameron seized on that and said, yes, we must have an inquiry.
Well, this is where David Cameron's financial illiteracy is important for the dictators that run the energy sector in the UK, because David Cameron can't understand that when prices go up an extraordinarily percentage above any possible inflation metric, and when you have gouging on the scale that you have now in an industry that's been convicted and charged and convicted and paid fines for manipulation, the fact that he needs an inquiry is like somebody needs to help David Cameron find his bottom so that he can wipe himself. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm so stupid. I've got to be the stupidest prime minister in the history of Britain. I'm so stupid that I need an inquiry to get Parliament to investigate where my bumhole is because I don't know how to wipe myself. That's how freaking stupid David Cameron is. If he can't see collusion and price manipulation in these big six predatory monopolists in the UK, he will go down in history as the biggest jackass in the history of British prime ministership, bar none. Nobody is as stupid as this idiot David Cameron.
Well, maybe there will be a bonfire night for him one day in the distant future. But, you know, there was also, speaking of bonfire, there was a bonfire of markets back in 2008. And as a result of that, that was caused by these fraudulent subprime mortgages and collateralized debt obligations blowing up the global economy, and especially the U.S. Well, out of that has emerged a new slumlord in America. Here's what happens when Wall Street builds a rental empire. Well, basically, they have installed toll booths to which you have to pay the toll, but you actually get no right of passage, essentially.
I think that's called a shakedown.
Hey, that's a good way to put it. So there's no escaping the stench of raw sewage in Mindy Culpepper's Atlanta area rental home. The odor greets her before she turns into her driveway each evening as she returns from work, is there when she prepares dinner, and only diminishes when she and her husband hunker down in their bedroom where they now have to eat their meals.
Because David Cameron was a visitor there, and he needs an inquiry to describe or figure out how to clean up after himself when he uses the toilet. So wherever he goes, it stinks.
Well, he could be, for all we know. She rents her home now from Colony American. The other two big rental firms in America now are Invitation Homes and American Homes for Rent. These are owned by private equity, hedge funds, mysterious guys. Billions and billions and billions of dollars have been spent to buy tens of thousands of homes. And now, prior to this new wave of toll booth collectors, most homes in America, rental homes, were owned by individuals. So you paid the landlord, you knew who he was or she was. Well, here...
Look. J.P. Morgan just paid a fine, multi-billion-dollar fine, for committing mortgage fraud. The problem with that mortgage fraud and the consequence of the mortgage fraud is that people were thrown out of their homes illegally. And now hedge funds, like the ones you're just describing, have come in and bought all these properties for 100% cash and are now renting them out to folks, but they're slumlords, they're absentee landlords. So now America's become a big prison camp, an open-air prison camp. America's become Gaza. Because America and Israel hates Gaza so much, they become Gaza. That's the human nature. You become what you hate. So now America has become the open-air prison of all these countries where they have imposed their drones and their draconian lending schemes to create poverty and destruction. That's now visited upon their own heads. And that's the karmic cycle of life. So get used to it, Americans. You now live in an open-air prison. Ha, ha, ha.
Well, let's look back at what this story is saying. Is like this woman, she has a sewage smell because she cannot physically contact the owners, the landlord, the slumlord. They will not answer the phone. They do not reply to any letters. There's no way for her to contact them. There's another guy they talked to, that Huffington Post talked to in the course of this research. And this guy also, he cannot go to his home because the sinks and the toilets don't work. And they will not fix it because he cannot get in touch with them. So what he's done is he's moved into a hotel nearby. So it's like the prison systems where the owners of the prisons also own the nearby hotels because the prisons are out in the middle of nowhere. So the families visiting the prisoners have to stay in these hotels, which the prison operators also own. So here these guys are also perhaps maybe owning the hotels nearby. It would be worth it because you can't stay in their homes.
Well, I call the state-sanctioned profitability. It's one of several themes on Wall Street that's a guaranteed moneymaker. It's like Rupert Murdoch is a big exploiter of this. He just bullies countries to give him satellite rights of way for broadcasting. It's a state-sanctioned profit. So here you've got the state being bullied into giving hedge funds unlimited housing stock to then rape people as slumlords and then own all the properties around those properties so that you cash in on an unlimited amount of income without putting up a nickel's worth of risk. Remember, these guys, if they were free marketeers, would be taking some risk. But when you've got a gunpowder plot, to bring this back to the 5th of November, remember Obamacare, there is no recourse because you're looking at 20 pounds of TNT that's going to explode on Wall Street unless everyone gives all the banksters all their money. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. What's more coming your way? Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Paris and speak with Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com. Charles, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Glad to be back on the show.
All right, Charles Hugh Smith, you've been blogging about a series of peaks, peak jobs, peak entitlements, peak retirement. Let's talk about peak retirement. If I'm a 25-year-old in America, will I ever be able to retire, Charles Hugh Smith?
Possibly around the age of 93. Part of it is the demographics of the population, and that's just a fancy way of saying that the number of workers is not rising as fast as the number of people who are entering retirement. And so one measure of that is the ratio of workers to retirees. And back in the good old days of the 1950s and 60s, that ratio was maybe 10 to 1, 10 workers for every retiree. Now the number of full-time workers to employees is 2 to 1.
All right, so let me explain this a little bit for viewers. In other words, in America, they have a system of payroll taxes, and those taxes go into these programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, but it requires that people have enough jobs and there be enough income from those jobs to keep this, what some call a good Ponzi scheme, going. So what you're saying is that the demographics are such that this good, so-called good Ponzi scheme is hit its top. It can't possibly grow anymore because you don't have enough jobs feeding into the system. So if I'm a 25-year-old right now, and I know that when I get to 60 or 65 or 70, there will be no retirement for me because the system is fundamentally, technically, systematically broken. Why should I still pay into the system? Shouldn't I be protesting that I don't want to pay into a system because mathematically speaking, I'll never see a penny from it, Charles?
what we can all hope for is the young generation realizes what you just said and does start protesting and demanding changes in the entire system, such that either they stop paying into a system that they will never extract any benefit from, or the retirees will have to start taking less, at least, especially those who can afford to take less.
Right. Well, we're seeing around the world now pension systems are being raided. We're seeing bank accounts being confiscated. Pension systems and pension pots are now a hugely rich target for governments that have run out of money, correct?
That's right. And also for Wall Street, which offers these pension funds which need a steady return of about 7%, Wall Street has offered them very risky deals in order to fund their retirees.
Right, so that's another byproduct, if you will, of 0% interest rate policies that the Fed and the Bank of England and other central banks have been pursuing over the past 5 or 6 years. Not only do savers get zero on their savings currently, not only does it cause deflation that screws workers, but it also is making these pension systems bankrupt, because you need at least 7%, as you're saying, to keep them funded in a way that works, so that when you do retire, you've got money. But since interest rates are so low, these pension funds are becoming bankrupt, and before they get bankrupt, states and corporations are now raiding their own pension funds to pay off the folks on the inside who don't seem to have any compunction whatsoever about simply stealing money. Now, we've had a series of bubbles, Charles Hugh Smith. You have a brilliant chart on your site detailing this. We've had the tech bubble, followed by the crash of the tech bubble, and then we had the housing bubble, and then we had the crash of the housing bubble. And now we're in what many, including yourself, call the bond bubble. Sovereign bond, even despite the record supply of bonds, are trading at 200, and in the case of Britain, a 300-year high. Some say that this bond bubble cannot collapse. What do you think?
Well, Max, as you've often covered on the show, it's all about credit and debt and collateral. And so the basic idea of bonds is that we're going to give you our cash in exchange for a promise of some sort of interest down the road. And the collateral of that is the government itself and its ability to tax the economy enough to pay the bonds. But I think the real issue is, what's the future of just expanding credit in like a never-ending cycle of we always need more, and yet the collateral on which the credit is based is not expanding at all. We still have the same economy, and yet we're leveraging enormous quantities of credit and debt on top of that.
Well, let's talk about that. The relationship between credit and the number one commodity in the world, oil. Since the U.S. went on the petrodollar in the early 1970s, you've seen both the energy markets and the credit markets expand almost exponentially because they feed into each other. You can't have multi-$100-billion exploration for energy without having an equal and concurrent expansion in the credit markets from these banks. So my question to you, Charles Hugh Smith, is which is going to be run out first? Are we going to hit peak oil in a way that is commensurate with a collapse, therefore, in credit, or will we hit peak credit first, and therefore there will be no money available to continue exploring for energy? And of course, a peak credit would look like what we see now, which is that governments, instead of attempting to solve their fiscal problems, simply expand the balance sheet of their central banks to the point where they implode on themselves. That would be a peak credit experience, and then there's no money to go out and explore for energy. But which comes first, Charles Hugh Smith? Do you have peak oil or peak credit? Which comes first?
That's a tough question, Max, but I'll take door number 2, that the credit bubble will burst before peak energy, at least in terms of supply. I think the missing ingredient there is what's the cost of that energy? And as you say, it requires a huge amount of credit to keep exploring for oil in these extreme environments. You know, we've used up all the easy to get stuff, so now it requires immense sums of money to explore on the further reaches of the energy spectrum. But I think we can also go to that old joke about what do you call 10,000 bankers at the bottom of the sea? And the answer, of course, is a good start. So if we want to solve our energy problems, maybe we have to tackle the credit bubble first.
Right. So maybe we're hitting peak banker at some point. But let's talk about China, where when bankers are caught stealing, they are subjected to capital punishment, which is a system I think would be interesting to be exported to other countries like the UK or the US. But let's talk about China for a second, because, of course, they are in a mad scramble around the world to secure energy resources. They have a huge pile of money there. They've got up to $4 trillion of cash, over $1 trillion, close to $2 trillion of that is in US dollars. They are the world's biggest creditor, but they see the writing on the wall here, and they've been very aggressively trying to hedge their bets by buying in huge amounts of gold in anticipation of this day when suddenly you hit the dollar hits its natural end of its natural life. Every empire and every currency eventually comes to a bitter end. But China, as a power, are they, do you think, adequately positioning themselves to live in a post-US dollar world, a post-US empire world? Are they making the smart moves, Charles?
Well, they're certainly making a smart move in, as you say, their attempts to secure oil supplies, particularly in Africa. As you say, the connection between oil and credit and a growing economy, or an economy that's sustainable, those are all linked. So to some degree, the Chinese attempts to secure oil is almost the equivalent of buying gold, in the sense that if you can secure access to oil, you've got real wealth.
Okay, and however, if I'm reading one of your essays correctly, you point out that China would not be in a position, or does not want to be in a position, to have a world reserve currency, because it would be a complete U-turn from the current situation of having a surplus of cash to being in deficit, correct?
That's the way I see it. Some people disagree and say that if China was sold its bonds globally and sort of opened its economy so that people could buy Chinese bonds, that would give the Chinese government the wherewithal, the means to export enough of its currency so the rest of the world would have enough yuan or renminbi to use for trade. Because that's basically what we've got here, is to have a reserve currency, you need about 1 trillion units of your currency out there in the world for people to use. Everywhere from street fairs in developing world countries to the major industrialized powers. Everybody needs a lot of the reserve currency just to transact business.
Some speculate, Charles, that China would not be interested so much in having the world reserve currency because it is a lot of infrastructure that's needed. You mentioned the bond market, but you also need a swaps market and a hedging market and a futures market. And they would prefer, some argue, if the dollar as reserve currency, that role was played by the currency of the IMF, which is the special drawing right, or the SDR, and then China would lobby to have a greater representation on the board of the IMF, and that they would be at least equally represented in the global currency market, unlike today, where they are treated really with almost disdain by the US. And this, of course, opens up the idea that the ultimate kicking of the can down the road would be if the dollar, the RMB, the euro, and the yen are rolled up essentially to a special drawing right, and then the IMF becomes the global bank of the world, the world's central bank. Christine Lagarde would be the Ben Bernanke or the Janet Yellen of planet Earth. How do you see this scenario playing out?
Well, Max, I think the question we would need to ask is who gets to print that the special drawing rights currency, and who controls how much of that is printed. And this kind of ties into some of your recent programs on Bitcoin. that some of us look at Bitcoin and wonder, gee, what if something like Bitcoin was the reserve currency? In other words, a non-state, non-government currency which was not being printed with abandon by a super financial elite. And so that may be the larger question is, how can we break out of using fiat currencies, whether they're IMF, Chinese, American, or Euro? How can we break out of that system?
Exactly, and that's how people like Rick Falkvinja in Sweden arrive at a target price of Bitcoin between $100,000 and $1 million, because it would take a sizable piece of that global Forex market. Anyway, Charles Hugh Smith, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com. If you'd like to get in touch, please tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.